Hello and welcome to Lesson 3. In the last lesson, I covered what mindfulness is, but in this lesson, the focus will be on what it looks like when we're not being mindful. This mode of being that's not mindful, that's not present-centered, doesn't exactly have a name, but in this lesson, I'll refer to it as mindlessness. Another good descriptive term for this mode of being would be autopilot. When we're in autopilot, it's as if we're going about our daily tasks while thinking about other things. It's like we're not really here. It's actually as if we're somewhere else. You might be asking why I'm devoting a lesson to what mindfulness isn't, but this is important too, because it's when we're in this state, when we're in the state of not being present, we can remember to direct our attention back to the present moment. And each time we do this, each time we remember to shift our focus back to the present, it's as if we're building a muscle in our minds, the muscle of mindfulness. Mindlessness comes in all different levels, from mildly distracted to the state of being totally unaware of what is happening in the present. The reality is that we are typically moving about somewhere on this dimension much of the time. This is our default way of being. It's not bad in itself, but may limit us if we spend too much time in this mode of being. There are also consequences for being too far on the extreme end of the spectrum. A network of pathways and areas in the brain has been identified as being very active during the times of mindlessness. It has been mapped out using magnetic resonance imaging and has been labeled the default mode network. Research has shown that these areas are activated when our minds are wandering and not engaged in a focused task. They deactivate or quiet when we engage in a focused task like math problems. We may be thinking about other people, thinking about ourselves, remembering the past, or imagining the future. And as you might imagine, this network is activated much of the time. Research has shown that we spend around 50% of time in this default mode. Our goal with this program is to increase the amount of time in the present-centered mindful mode in which different parts of the brain are activated. These parts of the brain are more highly correlated with mental health and well-being. So when we're doing nothing, our brains are actually very active, thinking about ourselves and about our story. But before we can shift into the mindfulness mode, it helps to recognize when we're not in it. We might do this by noticing certain behaviors that will serve as a cue. For instance, forgetting where you put things, like your phone. Perhaps even searching for your keys only to notice that they're actually in your pocket, or your sunglasses only to notice that, wow, they're on your head. Multitasking or engaging in several behaviors at once is another good sign. As it turns out, we can't actually follow more than one thing at a time with our attention. It rapidly shifts back and forth, costing us efficiency. Rushing through a meal without even noticing what it tastes like is another great example that probably happens to each of you almost every day. Or perhaps you've arrived somewhere and then you recognize you don't even remember the process of driving. Quite simply, the mindlessness mode involves being distracted from what is in front of us, either through being lost in thoughts or engaging in something that takes us away from where we are. The picture here shows the old school example of daydreaming or being distracted from what we've set out to do. This little girl was actually supposed to read a book, and she's off somewhere else in her mind. Now this is a much more familiar experience in the digital age of distraction. These students could be talking to each other or even experiencing a nice spring day. Instead, they're all totally absorbed in their texts or perhaps the latest tweet from a celebrity. But why is mindlessness a problem? Well, it's not a problem in itself. As I said, it's our default mode. But it can be a problem at the extreme ends of the spectrum, and when we spend too much time there at the expense of being present. Some of the obvious consequences of mindlessness involve accidents, especially while driving, forgetting things that might be important, and difficulty focusing on what we need to do to complete necessary tasks. And as we'll discuss more, our mind typically goes to what is bothering us when we're in this mode. Most of us engage in these mindless tasks, and this does not necessarily cause problems in our day, but the cumulative effect, which is less obvious and typically unseen, involves things like missing out on the richness around us. We're surrounded by blessings that we don't even notice, and our children grow up in the blink of an eye. Unclear direction or purpose. We lose sight of what's important, and we don't orient ourselves towards goals that line up with our values. And being distracted or mindless is particularly problematic for our relationships. I recall a graduate colleague who used to share how she would be planning dinner while meeting with one of her less interesting clients. I was surprised that she would admit to it, but I know that I've done this too. We can't help that our mind occasionally wanders when we're with another person, but it's clearly a sign that we're not fully engaged with them. The more I have practiced mindfulness, the more fully engaged I've become with my clients, and I believe they feel much more heard. I've occasionally considered what was on the menu for dinner during a session with a client, but I'm better at catching myself and returning to the room. You might also relate to being with a child or spouse and partially responding to them as you're looking at your phone or computer. Perhaps you felt guilty afterward for not being present. We all have the experience of wondering where the other person went when we're trying to talk to them. We know how that feels. What if we intentionally tried to be more present? Well, practicing mindfulness can help you to live a more intentional life and to follow your beliefs and values. As you listen to this information about mindlessness, it's important not to get too frustrated if you realize that this sounds a lot like you. Because the truth is, this is a lot like all of us. We all struggle going through the day and being pulled away from the present moment by the countless competing demands and activities that we have in our lives. But why is it so hard for human beings to be mindful? I think it's important that we understand this. The problem here is that we're trying to cultivate something that runs counter to our typical way of being. It runs counter to what comes naturally to us. It is also very different from what we experience in our current culture. So this next part of the lesson is going to focus on several of the important reasons why it's hard for us to be mindful. We have a hard time being present because it's not in our nature. We have a nature in which we tend to look toward the future. We have an image of how we want life to be, and we often picture it in our heads. Planning and thinking about the future, for instance, saving for retirement, can be very adaptive and healthy. The problem is when we get caught up in thoughts about the future, so much so that we devalue what is happening now. For instance, we might say, I'll be happy when I get that house, or things will be great when I have more time to do what I want. If you reflect, you might notice a tendency to think this way at all stages in life. So do we ever really get to that place when we aren't thinking about how things will be better one day? Again, this causes us to miss what is right here, right now. Another reason that we struggle with mindfulness is that we live in a culture focused on action and getting things done. This tendency has not been entirely bad, as it's made us adaptive in many areas, but it also has its downsides. For instance, our culture has the highest rates of depression and anxiety in the world. We can call our engagement in action and task completion the doing mode. We value this mode so much that we've devalued the time spent in the being mode, where mindfulness lives. That is the cost of focusing on doing and accomplishing at the expense of sitting still and being present. We need a balance to be healthy. Another area that serves as a roadblock to our living more mindfully is what psychologists call experiential avoidance. This is a fancy term to describe our natural tendency to avoid our inner world. It's like when a child covers their eyes and thinks nobody sees them. By distracting ourselves and keeping busy, our minds trick us into believing that we can avoid what we're feeling. This concept is very important, especially as it helps explain how mental health problems such as anxiety, depression, and addictions develop. I'll spend much more time on this later. Just know that mindfulness practice helps us to be with our experience more comfortably. Remember Goldilocks? She was in pursuit of just the right experience, not too hot, not too cold, not too soft, or too hard. We're like Goldilocks in the way we adjust our experience to be just right. We complain when we go outside of our comfort zone. This leaves us unable to tolerate much of what's happening around us. This again leads to frustration, depression, maybe even drug use. But simply put, we can't be with what is, so we're always trying to change it. One way to do this is by thinking about how things will be better in the future, or remembering how things were better in the past. The last hurdle that I'll talk about is our distraction by technology. You've likely heard about the amount of time we spend on our screens, and studies that have shown the detrimental effects of this. The more we act on the urge to pick up our phones during a lull in our day, the more we diminish our time spent in the present moment. I think we all realize that this will only get worse. And it's no surprise that with the increase in distractions, we're seeing an increase in anxiety and depression in our country. Research shows that social media is like an addiction, and that the more time we spend on Facebook, the more likely we are to be depressed. The key point here is that we can benefit greatly from putting the screens aside and practicing mindfulness. This is why mindfulness is so important in our current age of technology. We need to balance our screen time with some time just being. Practicing mindfulness can serve as a preventative measure to reduce the likelihood that we'll develop problems such as depression, anxiety, or even chronic pain and illness. Practicing mindfulness can actually allow us to turn the tide and change the way we're being sucked in to technology. It's not that technology is bad. No, technology is great. For one thing, if we didn't have technology, I wouldn't have this course. And I'm so grateful that I'm able to provide this information to so many people through technology. But again, it's important to recognize that we can't spend too much time here, or this has detrimental effects on our mental health. So that's all for today. In this next lesson, I'll go over why mindfulness is so beneficial, including some key research findings that I think will really boost your motivation to practice.